So I was at this high-level organizational transformation summit a few months ago. The setting was, one of those hyper-modern innovation hubs.
Right, I can picture it.
Yeah, lots of exposed brick, artisanal coffee, and these walls just covered in those giant neon Post-it notes. They're supposed to scream change is happening.
Of course, the mandatory artifacts of innovation.
Exactly. The atmosphere was electric. The CEO gets up on this small stage, and he's ditched the suit for a hoodie, and he's talking with such raw, sincere conviction about dismantling silos and radical transparency.
The new vocabulary of leadership.
Absolutely. And you could just see the employees in the front row. They were leaning in, eyes bright, feeling like they were finally part of something that really mattered. It felt like a genuine turning point.
Okay.
But then, during the Q&A, this junior analyst asks a very simple, very polite question. He asks how these new values would affect the year-end bonus structure.
Ah, the money.
The money, which, as it stood, was still entirely based on individual sales targets.
Oh.
And the silence that followed was just deafening. The CEO didn't get angry. He just glided. He pivoted right back to the vision, using even more inspiring language about mindset shifts and cultural DNA.
A masterclass in deflection.
It was, without ever touching the actual money. In that moment, the energy in the room, it didn't just drop. It curdled. I watched those bright-eyed employees just slowly lean back.
Yeah.
Their expressions shifted from hope to this very familiar, very tired kind of recognition.
They've seen this movie before.
They've seen it 1,000 times. It was a perfect example of what you might call the Reform Choreography. Everything on the surface, the language, the clothes, the glossy reports, it was all meticulously modernized.
But the deep structure,
the underlying architecture, the parts that actually dictate how people behave and who holds power, hadn't moved an inch. It was a lot of motion, but zero displacement. And it just left me wondering, why do we spend so much energy on these elaborate performances of change when deep down, everyone in the room knows the script hasn't actually been rewritten?
That anecdote is the perfect lens for this entire deep dive. It's exactly what we're going to explore. What you witnessed was the system engaging in that reform choreography, an elaborate surface-level performance of change.
Right, the language, the appearance, the org charts, they'll get a facelift.
We're all meticulously updated to look modern and responsive. But like you said, this achieves zero genuine displacement of the underlying structures, the incentive systems, and critically, the power dynamics that actually govern behavior.
So that's our mission today.
That's it. Our mission is to explore the sociological frameworks and the compelling case studies that explain why organizations, when they're facing pressure or a crisis of legitimacy, consistently choose to signal movement and progress rather than confront the painful, costly, and often politically explosive business of true structural transformation.
We're looking at the disconnect.
The fundamental disconnect between rhetoric and reality, and really how the system is designed to maintain that very gap.
Okay, let's unpack this with some organizational theory, because that moment in the summit where the rhetoric about transparency completely fractured when confronted with the actual practice of the bonus structure, that fracture, that has a name, doesn't it?
It does. We call that decoupling. Within organizational studies, and particularly neo-institutionalism, decoupling is the creation and maintenance of a significant and often intentional gap between an organization's formal policies.
The glossy vision, the mission statement, the stuff the CEO says on stage.
Exactly. A gap between all of that and its actual day-to-day practices.
So it's not just incompetence or, miscommunication. You're saying this is a feature of organizational life, not a bug.
Absolutely. It is a structural phenomenon, and the research confirms it's just pervasive across the board. You see it in government agencies, educational institutions, police departments, and of course, major corporations. They all exhibit decoupling.
But the critical question, then what I was left with, is why? Why go through all the effort of creating a policy, putting it in a formal document, if you have no serious intention of following it through to the painful incentive-based layers?
Well, is it simply easier to fool regulators and stakeholders with a detailed policy document than it is to actually change the entire payroll system and disrupt entrenched interests?
I mean, in many ways, yes.
That's a huge part of it. Organizational survival is the primary driver. Decoupling is the mechanism that allows organizations to achieve external legitimacy.
Okay, so it's about looking good to the outside world.
It lets them demonstrate to external stakeholders, the media, investors, regulators, the public, that they're compliant with current institutional expectations, whether whether those expectations are for sustainability or diversity or radical transparency.
And at the same time,
Simultaneously, they maintain internal flexibility. This means they can continue to address the practical, often conflicting demands of the day-to-day work, which are usually tied to these pre-existing, non-negotiable incentive structures, like the bonus system you mentioned.
that brings us right to John W. Meyer, whose work is just foundational here. He kind of shifts the whole focus from internal efficiency to this external perception.
Meyer's work is crucial. He argues that organizations adopt institutionalized practices and formal structures, which he famously terms myths, to achieve that essential legitimacy with the external environment.
They're performing for an audience.
They are performing for their audience. The fundamental goal isn't technical efficiency, it's survival through cultural alignment.
So if the institutional environment, the management consultants, the business press, the investment banks, if they all dictate that a modern organization must have a decentralized, transparent structure,
Then the organization adopts that language and that framework.
even if it contradicts the most efficient way to actually produce their goods or services internally.
Precisely. And this dynamic is known as loose coupling. The formal structure, the published rules, the org chart on the wall, becomes what Meyer calls myth and ceremony. The organization is more worried about looking appropriate and up-to-date to the institutional environment
I say.
than it is about making sure the internal workings are actually efficient or, frankly, coherent.
Exactly. The formal image is everything, because that image determines whether the outside world keeps funding you, regulating you gently, or investing in you.
This sounds incredibly fragile. I mean, when the formal structure is a myth, when the organization is focused on ceremony rather than substance, how do we even identify that functional failure?
We see the failure manifest as means-ends decoupling. This happens when the actual results of an initiative are radically distant from what was initially expected or promised. The classic example in contemporary organizational life is the huge push toward ESG criteria.
Environmental, social, and governance.
Right. So you see these huge, elaborate corporate sustainability initiatives, the means with massive reporting teams, complex frameworks, annual reports dedicated to the topic.
Yet when independent auditors look at the actual environmental impact, the ends, it's often negligible or even negative. The tremendous effort, the investment in bureaucracy, the sheer volume of paper and planning, it just doesn't match the desired outcome.
So why?
Because the reform concentrates on the highly visible layers, the language, the reporting tools, the creation of a chief sustainability officer role.
While deliberately avoiding the inconvenient deeper layers.
Yes.
Like, for instance, dramatically cutting carbon-intensive production processes or rewriting the massive logistics contracts that actually cause the pollution. That's where the power and the real cost rest.
That's the key structural distinction. Reform targets what's easy to see and cheap to change. It meticulously avoids the incentive systems, the established power distribution among elite management, and the informal norms that truly shape how people behave on the ground.
That junior analyst's question about the bonus structure.
It perfectly crystallized the inconvenient layer. He went right for it.
And when that inconvenient truth comes to the surface, the organization's response is to just double down on the performance. So what is the systemic function of all this? This motion without displacement?
Its core function is to manage collective stakeholder anxiety. When systems face functional decay or market pressure or a crisis of trust, which happens all the time in modern complex institutions, symbolic reform produces immediate reassurance. It's an institutional tranquilizer.
How so?
It generates a continuous stream of deliverables, reports, updated frameworks, new titles, initiatives. These artifacts make the organization look responsive, progressive, and most importantly, in control. And that manages the legitimation deficit.
So that suggests that the system's objective isn't to fix the problem, but to manage the political fallout from the perception of the problem. That sounds incredibly draining for those doing the actual work, but highly successful for the system's survival.
It is.
That connects perfectly to this idea of institutional reform evolving into a kind of therapeutic mechanism for managing anxiety, rather than addressing actual structural decay. I remember reading an account that it captured this perfectly.
Let's hear it.
This was the story of Sarah, a nurse working in a public hospital in the north of England. The hospital was dealing with all the classic signs of structural decay: crumbling infrastructure, outdated facilities, a desperate shortage of beds.
A crisis of resources, basically.
Yes. And the hospital board, faced with this crisis of resources and legitimacy, decided not to allocate the massive funds needed for a real structural fix. Instead, they launched a great patient experience initiative.
Which is a purely psychological and symbolic intervention aimed right at managing perception.
Exactly. They hired a fleet of patient harmony coordinators.
Yeah.
These coordinators, dressed in these calming pastel uniforms, would walk through overcrowded hallways where families had often been waiting 10 hours for an emergency room bed and offer them herbal tea and guided meditation brochures.
Unbelievable.
Sarah watched as the hospital spent its entire quarterly maintenance budget on digital scent diffusers and brightly colored serenity murals for the waiting areas.
Meanwhile,
The oxygen piping in the older wing remained dangerously outdated, a risk they just absorbed.
that is profound. The structural necessity fixing the oxygen piping is completely ignored because it's expensive, disruptive, and invisible to the public.
Right.
But the psychological necessity, managing the trauma and anger of patients and families, is addressed with these symbolic, highly visible gestures. It turns a resources crisis into a psychological state that can be managed therapeutically.
The hospital can report that it is proactively addressing patient experience, a measurable, visible artifact, while ignoring the necessary, inconvenient, multi-million-dollar structural investment. The performative kindness becomes a substitute for structural integrity.
And this anxiety management ties into a broader sociological framework that explains the political foundation of this performance developed by Jürgen Habermas, the legitimation crisis in advanced capitalism.
Habermas's work really helps us understand how this symbolic performance becomes necessary when the state or large institutions overpromise and underdeliver.
He argued that as advanced capitalism matured, the state took on increasing responsibility to manage crises. It intervened in the economy, providing welfare, regulating markets, ensuring full employment, to prevent the economic collapses predicted by earlier critics.
So the state successfully prevents an economic collapse, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
But that state intervention creates a new problem.
It creates a new political or socio-cultural crisis. When the state steps in to steer the economy and society, to fix a financial crash, to provide universal health care, to manage social justice issues, it takes on this unprecedented responsibility for all outcomes.
And when authority takes responsibility, the expectation upon it becomes absolute.
Exactly. When it inevitably fails to deliver on these comprehensive expectations, because no system can manage everything perfectly, that creates a gap between the expectation and the reality.
And that gap creates the legitimation crisis. Political authority fails to attract mass loyalty because its actions are viewed as arbitrary or self-serving rather than serving the collective good.
Right. And this legitimacy deficit, in turn, triggers a motivation crisis. Why should citizens or employees bother supporting a system? Why should they sacrifice or follow the rules if the normative structures, the shared beliefs and values that underpin the system, fail to provide the necessary justification?
So if the underlying contract of capitalism, work hard and you will be rewarded, is consistently broken, the motivation to uphold the system just collapses.
Exactly. And when loyalty and motivation are scarce, symbolic reform is then deployed as a superficial attempt to supply that missing legitimacy. It's a way to signal adherence to the expected norms, transparency, efficiency, caring, in order to shore up mass loyalty and keep the system functional, even if it's structurally hollowed out.
The performance stabilizes the system without actually fixing the foundation.
Precisely.
So we see the sociological framework, this drive for legitimacy, the anxiety management, the structural decoupling. Let's ground this in high finance, because nowhere is this surface-level change more apparent than under the ruthless mandate of shareholder value management ideology, or SHV.
The SHV ideology, which dates back to the mid-1970s, acts as a powerful institutional myth. It socially constructs what counts as legitimate corporate behavior. Under this banner, organizational restructuring is mythologized as the most potent symbolic method for value creation.
The message to the market is always, we are lean, we are aggressive, and we are eliminating waste to maximize returns for you, the owner.
It's a powerful story, a story that's strong enough to justify massive disruptions and layoffs, all in the name of efficiency. Yet when we look at the case study of Corp, a major industrial corporation operating under this ideology, the financial records tell a story of profound decoupling.
They reveal that the primary financial lever was not operational efficiency, but sheer transactional power.
We can detail the financial hypocrisy. From 2010 to 2014, Corp invested a massive US $4.37 billion in acquisitions. This is inorganic growth, just buying other companies, which instantly boosts the appearance of size, revenue, EBITDA, and cash flow. That is where the real financial muscle was flexed.
And the investment in restructuring, the actual operational change, the thing the CEO talks about in the annual report, was comparatively tiny.
It was US $459 million over the same period.
So that's almost a 10-to-1 ratio.
It's 10 times the capital dedicated to buying things versus fixing things internally. The financial strategies of acquisitions and divestiture were the main event, but they weren't the main narrative.
Why the narrative shift? Why is restructuring so overemphasized in official literature, presented as this ongoing strategy and the source of all value?
Because the reality of inorganic growth is volatile and often, frankly, embarrassing. To signal commitment to SHV, the company needs a stable, positive story. The problem is that the acquisitions often went badly. In 2014, for example, Corp had a humiliating US $508 million goodwill impairment write-down, essentially admitting they grossly overpaid for a 2010 acquisition. These write-downs crater share prices and publicly contradict the narrative of brilliant value creation.
So the restructuring narrative, even if it is comparatively cheap and mostly symbolic, it's a clean, controllable story that signals virtuous activity. It masks the volatile, high-risk reality of the acquisition strategy. It's a PR shield.
Exactly. And that shield is often embodied and championed by the figurehead, the celebrity CEO. The chairman and CEO of Core was elevated to this status, yet his personal actions become this living contradiction of the very ideology he promotes.
The SHV ideology is supposed to have an anti-managerial impulse, right? It preaches executive frugality and alignment with the interests of the dispersed owners. The CEO should behave like a highly efficient steward.
Instead, this executive maintained luxury perks totaling nearly $500,000 annually for personal use of company cars and airplanes, club fees, entertainment, personal financial consulting. If the ideology demands sacrifices from the workforce, it has to demand sacrifice from the elite.
And that did not happen.
It did not happen. And the safety net he constructed for himself is just staggering. A massive golden parachute with $50 million in stock options waiting for him in case of a takeover.
It's financial insulation against the very risks that SHV ideology claims he should be embracing as an owner-aligned manager.
It is. Furthermore, he concentrated power by holding both the CEO and chairman positions, which flies in the face of corporate governance best practices. And anti-takeover measures were established under his watch, like abolishing the cumulative vote for the board back in 1989. This structural maneuver made it far harder for shareholders to coalesce and challenge entrenched interests.
So the sources are blunt. The anti-managerial impulse of SHV ideology is highly symbolic, and this CEO's status and actions demonstrate that elite power remains deeply entrenched despite the rhetoric of shareholder control. The ideological performance serves to protect the powerful.
And that dynamic, the administrative choreography, serving as a defensive layer to preserve existing power distributions while signaling a false adherence to meritocratic progress, that is universal across high-pressure organizational fields.
We see that same dynamic in the tech sector, for instance. I heard the story of Elena, a middle manager at a high-growth Silicon Valley tech firm. To address mounting public diversity complaints, the company hired these expensive consultants to choreograph a horizontal leadership transformation.
The vocabulary signals full compliance with the progressive institutional myths. Eliminating traditional titles, introducing creative partners, holding radical transparency circles.
But the underlying structure was completely untouched. The actual decisions were still made by the same 3 founding members over private weekend golf games. The promotion algorithm, supposedly the objective crown jewel of this meritocratic overhaul, was secretly calibrated to favor those who logged late-night hours.
Which only the founders' inner circle had the time or ability to maintain.
Exactly. The organization effectively performed transparency and meritocracy. By removing visible titles and changing the language, they signaled evolution to the world.
But these maneuvers were designed to preserve the existing power distribution by making it harder to critique the actual decision makers. You can't point to the boss when the power is concealed behind a supposedly neutral algorithm or informal social networks.
It is the illusion of meritocracy serving to legitimize oligarchy.
Yes.
Which brings us back to Core and its attempt to implement a high-profile, deeply symbolic change in its Brazilian subsidiary, the failed Brazilian restructuring. They created shared services units, SSUs, to centralize functions like HR, finance, and supply.
Right, aiming to transform internal relationships into pseudo-market ones where business units, or BUs, paid SSUs for services.
This was textbook adherence to the SHV mandate, replacing productive logic, with financial logic. It looked great on paper and signaled global compliance.
But the outcomes were perverse.
This performative act resulted in the exact opposite of its stated cost-cutting goal. When they tracked the numbers, payroll costs increased from 22.48% of Brazilian operation revenue in 2010 before restructuring to 22.86% in 2013 after the restructuring was supposedly complete.
The system fought back. The SSU creation caused massive internal conflict. Centralized managers asserted authority, upsetting powerful BU leaders accustomed to their privileges. The new structure was perceived as organizational upsizing, leading to unintended consequences like high-wage managers being terminated, only to be immediately rehired via better remunerated outsourcing contracts due to unmanageable work overload.
So the complexity of the new formal structure actually generated higher costs, not lower ones. And the system developed an internal defense mechanism against the market logic they were trying to impose.
That's the fascinating sociological finding. The BUs and SSUs developed a bailing out system. They actively cooperated to hide SSU costs from headquarters.
How did that work?
BUs would absorb another BU's SSU expenses temporarily to avoid delivering bad quarterly numbers. This collaboration actively subverted the market-based relationship goal. The stated goal was transparent, arm's-length competition, but the outcome was collusion, purely to produce favorable results on paper.
It's the ultimate act of decoupling. The people on the ground recognize the performance requirements and cooperate to ensure the performance looks good, even if the internal efficiency suffers.
And the most revealing detail about the true purpose of the restructuring is what it failed to touch. The single most labor-intensive and costly operation production remained decentralized across all 4 business units in Brazil.
Centralizing production would have been the logical cost-cutting measure, especially since they had outsourced production in other Latin American subsidiaries. Why the exception for Brazil?
Because centralizing production would have been the genuine disruptive structural change. It risked massive Brazilian union reaction and required immense investment and disruption. Leaving it decentralized proved definitively that the restructuring was a symbolic exercise.
A necessary enactment to show the capital market they were responsive.
Rather than a determined, technically rational cost-cutting measure.
And the director's quote is the ultimate confession of this ritual. He admitted, "Listen, I know we did not reach the expected synergy gains. I know that, quite the opposite, we ended up spending even more. But we have to prove we can transform fixed costs into variable ones. That means we had to set the restructuring into motion anyway.
It gets worse.
From now on, we have to constantly show them that we can do it, that we're able to do what everybody else is doing besides doing our jobs. In fact, doing it became part of our job."
That is the core takeaway for the listener. The performance itself became an organizational function, essential for maintaining legitimacy and managing anxiety, entirely decoupled from the actual operational outcome. The act of changing is the objective, not the change itself.
We've established that this impulse to perform change is driven by legitimacy and anxiety management. But to truly understand why reform fails to displace power, we need a structural explanation for this consistent preservation of the status quo. We have to address the iron constraint, elite rule.
This constraint is crystallized in Robert Michels's iron law of oligarchy. Michels asserted that rule by a specialized elite is an inevitable structural tendency in all complex organizations, irrespective of their original democratic or egalitarian ideals.
He famously declared, "Who says organization says oligarchy?"
It's a powerfully cynical statement, but it speaks to the reality we see in corporations and institutions alike.
So what is the structural rationale behind this iron law?
Michels argues it's a consequence of the technical necessities of organization itself. As organizations grow more complex, they require bureaucracy, centralization, and delegation just to maintain efficiency. You need specialists, administrators, and spokespersons. This necessity concentrates knowledge, skills, and control over resources among a specialized leadership class.
So the leaders become indispensable, not necessarily because they are inherently superior, but because they are the only ones who understand the totality of the complex system they manage. They're alienated from the rank and file by virtue of specialized knowledge.
Exactly. This concentrated knowledge creates an automatic structural advantage. The leadership class, functioning as paid administrators, inevitably grows to dominate the organization's power structure. Their self-interest, their job security, and the continuity of their power become paramount.
Michels believed that the mechanism of organization itself confers dominion of the elected over the electors.
And that historical evolution mocks all preventative measures adopted against this oligarchy.
This gives us the structural reason why the celebrity CEO, despite all the rhetoric of shareholder control, could amass concentrated power and protect his $50 million golden parachute. He is an indispensable specialist elite.
And this entrenched elite power translates directly into the daily workplace culture, creating a pervasive culture of hierarchy and silence in practice. We can see this very clearly in a qualitative study examining nurses' adoption of evidence-based practice, or EBP, in tertiary hospitals.
EBP adoption is a clear policy goal aimed at modernization and improved quality. It requires critical thinking, it requires questioning old methods, but we see that this policy is continually crippled by hierarchy and these entrenched organizational norms.
The formal structure encourages critical inquiry, but the organizational culture overrides it. The primary barrier identified was the leadership distance and power imbalance. Nurses described these rigid organizational hierarchies where authority figures, managers, or physicians dictated practice.
So questioning established, top-down protocols was immediately seen as challenging authority.
Immediately. They are forced into a contradictory role. On one hand, policy tells them to be evidence-based and critical. On the other, culture tells them to be obedient.
Right.
One nurse's observation encapsulates this tension perfectly. You're expected to follow protocols without questioning them. If a head nurse doesn't believe in a change, the evidence is irrelevant. This immediately fosters passive compliance norms.
So even when nurses knew a better evidence-based approach existed, the risk of challenging the established hierarchy was just too high, both socially and professionally.
They prioritized harmony and conformity, the don't rock the boat norm over critical inquiry, meaning outdated practices were perpetuated simply to avoid conflict. The result is a profound suppression of professional voice.
The dissonance is immense. The organization nominally advocates for EBP, but structurally rewards obedience.
As another participant lamented, we're taught to be obedient before we're taught to be evidence-based. If I, as a nurse, try to implement a new guideline I learned in training, but the long-serving charge nurse does things the old way, I know who I have to listen to keep my job.
This creates symbolic EBP. The messaging around evidence-based practice is highly visible. It's on posters, in mission statements, and performance review documents. It acts as a buzzword.
Yet, the structural support, the time to research, the budget for new tools, transparent protocol update mechanisms is completely absent.
It becomes a classic case of symbolic compliance.
The intense activity during audits or the formation of EBP committees is perceived by the staff as surface level or just for show. They are performing the ritual of EBP without committing to the substance, purely for external legitimacy. The systemic failure to provide transparent mechanisms for updating protocols turns EBP into a bureaucratic compliance checkbox rather than a dynamic component of care.
And the force that enforces this is also not the CEO, but the people immediately around you, which highlights the strength of peer influence and informal norms.
That's right. Formal policies set the ideal structure, but the informal norms, the unit-level microcultures, determine actual practice. Senior staff often set the tone of resistance or acceptance.
So if a unit develops a subculture of resistance, the reform dies right there, regardless of where the policy came from.
Exactly. Junior nurses, particularly, adopt behaviors by mimicking their peers because following the tone set by the team accelerates adaptation and acceptance within the unit. This often perpetuates non-evidence-based practices.
It's the institutional equivalent of peer pressure, ensuring that the culture of silence and passive compliance endures. But despite this stifling environment, the study also reveals a fascinating measure of agency among the nurses.
Yes, the human factor resists complete subjugation. Many nurses sustained EBP through sheer personal commitment and professional identity. They viewed the use of evidence as a source of professional pride, a marker of being a real clinician. Their strategy became one of quiet resistance.
How does that quiet resistance manifest?
It's highly tactical. They frame evidence diplomatically as suggestions rather than challenges. They perform small, evidence-based changes in their own immediate practice without drawing attention.
So they're not rocking the boat, but they're still steering their own little corner of it.
Precisely. One participant noted, "I ask, would you be open to trying this approach I read about? That way, I'm not threatening authority, but I'm still doing the best thing for the patient." This is agency operating within severe hierarchical constraints, a way for the professional to honor their identity and professional mandate without facing the full weight of the entrenched obedience system.
The dynamics of symbolic performance and deep structural resistance, they seem to be amplified in the public sector, where the decoupling between means and ends carries the highest social cost.
We see this most clearly in education, particularly in discussions surrounding underperforming schools.
Let's look at Title I schools, where the core issue is the profound problem of means-ends decoupling, stemming from what you could call the miracle expectation. Teachers are expected to work educational miracles.
The expectations are enormous and often mathematically impossible. Close gaps of 5 or 6 years, differentiate for a classroom of 30 students with wildly varying needs, and show huge growth every 6 weeks. These demands are completely divorced from the actual realities the students face.
We're talking about inconsistent attendance, extreme academic deficits, dealing with trauma, family instability, limited support at home.
The failure to meet basic needs like shelter and food, which are prerequisites in Maslow's hierarchy.
And this expectation deliberately ignores foundational sociological data. Decades ago, the Coleman Report found that family background has the strongest statistical correlation to academic achievement. While schools matter, focusing solely on the school environment ignores the most complex and dominant variable in student outcomes.
This structure seems designed for failure. If external factors are the dominant variable, but we are only allowed to modify internal factors, then the system is fundamentally set up to fail the structural test.
It's a political necessity, not an educational one.
How so?
Teachers are the easiest lever to pull for accountability. Taxing the community more for resources or confronting voters and parents about structural inequalities is politically unfeasible and risky. So the accountability burden shifts to the internal actors, the teachers and administrators, who are relatively powerless to resist.
This leads to the dominance of administrative theater. Instead of providing the necessary structural resources, mental health support, social workers, smaller class sizes, the administrative focus shifts to highly measurable, visible activities.
Things like complex data tracking systems, hyper-detailed lesson plans that must be submitted and approved, and behavior tracking systems like PBIS.
These are activities that consume massive amounts of teacher time and administrative energy. One teacher noted the absurdity of being tasked with catching Algebra 2 students up on 8 years of missing education, while the administration simply mandates more sentence starters or graphic organizers.
It's the industrial model applied to education. We supply a worker, we demand a standard result, and if the result is lacking, the worker must fill out a more complicated form to prove they tried hard enough. This theater fails to provide the basic support needed to address a student's fundamental needs, like homelessness or starvation.
The paradox is that teachers are simultaneously judged by outdated, often arbitrary bureaucratic rules, while being told to teach based on the latest evidence. The system conveniently blames the teacher, ignoring the complex challenges students and families face. It's deflection in the public sphere.
This cycle of displacement and deflection seems to reach its sociological peak in the use of the therapeutic substitute, where institutional reform is meant to manage distress instead of solving the root problem. We saw it with the hospital example earlier.
Right, where funds were diverted to patient harmony coordinators and serenity murals instead of fixing the outdated oxygen piping, turning a resources crisis into a psychological state.
That story demonstrates the evolution of institutional reform into a therapeutic mechanism. It's an easy, visible fix that avoids the costly, necessary fix. This dynamic is replicated whenever organizations prioritize bureaucratic formality over complex, messy human social dynamics.
There's a fascinating account about a small, tight-knit town in the German countryside that operated for decades on organic social glue.
Meaning, governance was relational and informal, built on trust.
Precisely. The local baker might help an elderly neighbor with their taxes on a Saturday afternoon. The mayor would settle small land disputes over a beer at the town hall. Trust networks and informal norms were the operational reality. They were invisible and hard to measure, but highly functional.
And then, the need for external legitimacy intrudes.
To meet modern transparency standards mandated by a regional government, the authorities replaced these organic networks with a mandatory digital civic compliance portal. Now, every interaction, every request, every dispute, every piece of advice must be logged, categorized, and submitted through a formal digital system using one of 40 different categorical codes.
The bureaucratic framework is artificially imposed onto a relational system.
And on paper, the system is perfectly efficient. The reports show 99% procedural compliance with the new mandates, and the regional government is thrilled.
Meanwhile, the baker has stopped helping with taxes because he refuses to log 3 hours of unbillable time on the portal. The mayor retired in frustration, and neighbors now sue each other through the formal codified portal instead of talking over a beer.
That is the ultimate trade-off. sacrificing highly functional yet invisible human connection for symbolic, measurable compliance. The system prioritizes whether you filled out the form correctly, transforming complex relational governance into something auditable.
It's a performative action that is perfectly legit in the eyes of the external auditor, yet completely hollowed out, having destroyed the operational reality, the social glue that made the community functional in the first place. The cost of compliance was the cost of community.
And that is why the cynicism runs so deep among those on the ground. They are forced to live and work within the painful dissonance of a system that is perfectly efficient on paper and devastatingly destructive in reality. They recognize the elaborate choreography because they're the ones forced to perform it every single day.
So, to wrap this all up, what have we really learned?
Our deep dive today reveals that when organizations face existential risk or pressure, they do not engage in genuine, costly transformation. Instead, they activate a configuration of powerful symbolic reflexes. They decouple rhetoric from practice, adopting institutionalized myths like transparency purely for external legitimacy.
They engage in intense symbolic compliance and administrative choreography.
Right, whether through corporate restructuring announcements or public sector data collection, purely to manage collective stakeholder anxiety. And they leverage the power conferred by bureaucracy, that iron law of oligarchy, to stabilize the system without ever confronting the high costs and genuine disruption required for real structural change.
What stands out to me is that the failure of reform is successful on paper. It's rarely a chaotic collapse. It's a quiet, methodical process that generates constant deliverables and positive reports. It's the successful performance of change, which only deepens the dissonance and cynicism among those inside the organization who are forced to live the lie.
And the persistence of organizational myth-making and these elaborate performative acts shows that despite the modern obsession with quantitative efficiency and maximizing value, institutions remain deeply subject to social dynamics. They continually structure a reality for themselves by responding to the powerful symbolic expectations they themselves have forged, ensuring that the script of structural change remains perpetually unwritten, but the symbolic performance never stops. The organization must, above all else, look like it's changing, even if it cannot afford to actually change.